Deep within an ancient forest where mist clings to towering pines like memories refusing to fade, there exists a place that shouldn't exist. A garden so perfectly hidden that it remained undiscovered for over 3 centuries. A place where the air itself seems to breathe, where rare flowers bloom in impossible colors, and where visitors report an overwhelming sense of peace so profound that they question whether they've stumbled upon nature's sanctuary or something far more mysterious. For generations, locals whispered about the Whispering Pines, a legendary garden shrouded in folklore, dismissed by skeptics as myth, yet sought by botanists, adventurers, and dreamers who couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, hidden beyond the veil of ordinary forest, this place was real. And then in 2019, everything changed. A lost hiker stumbled out of the wilderness after 3 days missing, disoriented but transformed. She spoke of impossible gardens, of mist that calmed her racing mind, of flowers she'd never seen in any textbook. Her story reignited a centuries-old mystery and launched a new era of investigation into what many now believe is nature's best-kept secret. Welcome back to History Unleashed, where we venture beyond the boundaries of the known world to uncover truths hidden in plain sight. I'm your host, and today we're embarking on an expedition into one of the most enchanting mysteries of our time, the search for the secret garden of Whispering Pines. From ancient indigenous knowledge to modern botanical science, from folklore whispered around forest fires to cutting-edge research into the garden's mysterious calming properties, we'll explore every layer of this extraordinary phenomenon. If you're ready to discover a place where nature reveals secrets that science is only beginning to understand, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we're about to uncover will transform how you think about hidden places. The power of the natural world, and the possibility that some of Earth's greatest wonders are still waiting to be found. So dim the lights, breathe deeply, and prepare your mind for a journey into the forest, where every shadow might conceal wonder, and every whisper of wind carries the promise of discovery. The origin stories of the Whispering Pines stretch back centuries, buried in the oral traditions and indigenous knowledge of the forest peoples who inhabited this remote region, long before modern cartography attempted to map and categorize the world. The earliest documented references appear in journals kept by 18th-century Spanish explorers, cryptic passages written by men who seemed uncertain whether they were recording geography or dreams. In 1743, a cartographer named Vicente Cordoba recorded in his expedition notes, "We encountered indigenous guides who spoke of a garden hidden within the ancient pines, a place where flowers bloomed in colors that did not exist elsewhere in God's creation, and where the very air itself possessed restorative properties. The natives called it the Garden of the Breathing Mist, and claimed it was sacred ground where their ancestors communed with the spirit of the forest. We attempted to locate this place, but found only dense woodland and impassable terrain. The guides seemed reluctant to lead us deeper, as though the forest itself resisted our intrusion." Cordoba's account would be forgotten in Spanish colonial archives for over 2 centuries, dismissed as the fevered imaginings of an exhausted explorer, or the exaggerated tales of indigenous peoples attempting to protect their sacred spaces from European exploitation. Yet the mention of flowers in impossible colors and air with restorative properties would resurface again and again throughout the 19th century, appearing in the journals of naturalists, botanists, and adventurers who ventured into this remote region, searching for undiscovered plant species. The forest itself occupies a unique geographical position, situated at the intersection of 2 major climate zones, elevated at approximately 2,200 meters above sea level, with perpetual cloud cover that creates conditions found nowhere else on Earth. The terrain is extraordinarily challenging, characterized by steep ravines, dense undergrowth, and ancient pines so massive and tightly packed that their canopy creates a twilight realm where conventional vegetation struggles to survive. This hostile environment actually served as the perfect protection for the garden, creating natural barriers that kept even the most determined explorers at bay. The indigenous Tsoa people, who inhabited this region for thousands of years before Spanish contact, possessed an intimate knowledge of every valley, every water source, every microclimate within the forest. In their oral traditions, carefully preserved through generations despite centuries of colonial suppression, there emerged a consistent narrative about a place they called Shimurakama, roughly translating to the Garden of the Sleeping Breath. According to SOA knowledge keepers, this garden was not a random occurrence of nature but a deliberately cultivated space, maintained over centuries by their ancestors through sophisticated, ecological practices that modern botanists are only now beginning to understand. The SOA believed that Shimurakama existed in a liminal space between ordinary forest and spiritual reality, a threshold where the natural and supernatural realms touched and interpenetrated. The garden was said to be home to plant species found nowhere else in the world, including several varieties with distinctive properties. Most importantly, the SOA reported that certain flowers in the garden released a naturally occurring mist with profound effects on human consciousness, inducing a state of deep calm, easing troubled minds and creating a sense of connection to the living world that transcended ordinary perception. Far from viewing this as a magical or supernatural phenomenon, modern botanical science suggests that the SOA understanding was grounded in sophisticated observation of plant chemistry. They recognize that certain plant species produce volatile organic compounds, airborne chemicals that directly affect human neurology and psychology. What the SOA described in spiritual language, we now understand in biochemical terms. The garden contained an unusual concentration of plants producing calming compounds, creating an atmosphere where human anxiety naturally diminished and peace seemed to be a property of the air itself. The Spanish conquest of the region in the 1540s brought catastrophic disruption to SOA society, and their careful stewardship of Shimurakama. Colonial authorities, driven by obsessions with finding gold and exploitable resources, had little interest in gardens of medicinal plants unless they could be rapidly harvested and sold for profit. The garden's true value, its existence as a carefully maintained ecosystem, its role in SOA spiritual and medicinal practices, its embodiment of centuries of ecological knowledge, was invisible to colonizers whose frameworks for understanding value centered entirely on commodities that could be extracted and exported. The SOA were systematically displaced, their populations decimated by disease and violence, their cultural practices suppressed through colonial policies that treated indigenous knowledge as worthless superstition. With the disruption of SOA society came the loss of the carefully preserved knowledge about Shimurakama's location and maintenance. The garden, which had been deliberately cultivated for centuries, gradually transitioned from actively managed space back toward wilderness. Yet something remarkable happened. The garden didn't disappear. Instead, it evolved into an increasingly rare and precious ecosystem, protected by its own inaccessibility and by the forest's gradual reclamation of human management. The 19th century brought a new wave of interest in the region, as scientific expeditions sought to catalog the extraordinary biodiversity of this remote forest. Naturalists like Heinrich Humboldt's successors ventured into the wilderness seeking unknown plant and animal species. Several of these expeditions generated accounts of unusual phenomena, areas where the forest seemed to possess extraordinary concentrations of rare species, where the air itself seemed to have unusual qualities. Where traveling became easier, the deeper one ventured into apparently impassable terrain. In 1891, a German botanist named Klaus van der Hoff documented his expedition into the region with meticulous attention to detail. His published account included a remarkable passage. "We discovered a microclimate so unusual that I can only describe it as a pocket of botanical impossibility. The concentration and diversity of rare species exceeded anything I have encountered in 30 years of tropical exploration. Most striking was the atmospheric phenomenon. The air possessed a quality I can only describe as alive, somehow responsive to human presence. Several expedition members reported unprecedented mental clarity and emotional calm during our time in this region. My skeptical mind inclines toward natural explanations. Perhaps the unique combination of plant life, soil chemistry, and atmospheric conditions creates effects on human neurology that we simply lack the scientific understanding to explain. Yet I found myself wondering whether we had stumbled upon something that indigenous peoples understood far more completely than we." Van der Hoff's account was dismissed by his contemporaries as unscientific romanticism, the kind of exaggeration that often plagued exploration narratives from the era. Yet his careful documentation of plant specimens, his measurements of atmospheric conditions, and his honest acknowledgement of the physical and psychological Effects experienced by his expedition team would eventually become valuable evidence supporting the existence of an unusual ecosystem whose properties defied simple explanation. Here's something that reveals how much indigenous knowledge we've lost through colonial conquest and cultural suppression. From which country are you watching this? Because every region has examples of traditional ecological knowledge that was dismissed as superstition or magical thinking before modern science confirmed its validity. What examples can you think of from your culture's history where traditional practices were later proven scientifically sound? Share your thoughts in the comments about how we can better honor and preserve indigenous wisdom before it's lost forever. The early 20th century brought a gradual shift in scientific attitudes toward indigenous knowledge and non-Western understandings of nature. Ethnobotany emerged as a discipline devoted to studying how traditional cultures utilize and understand plant species. Researchers began systematically collecting oral histories from indigenous communities, finally treating indigenous knowledge as a valid source of information about ecosystems and plant properties rather than dismissing it as folklore. This shift in perspective rekindled scientific interest in the whispering pines. Researchers tracking down the last surviving Soa knowledge keepers recorded detailed accounts of Shimurakama from elders who had learned about the garden through oral tradition, even if they themselves had never visited it. These accounts were consistent across multiple sources. Different knowledge keepers described the same location characteristics, the same plant species, the same properties of the air that made ordinary time seem to slow and deepen. By the mid-20th century, a new generation of researchers, botanists, ethnobotanists, and adventurers began attempting to locate the garden using a combination of indigenous oral histories, historical documents, and modern geographical analysis. Several expeditions came tantalizingly close, discovering areas of the forest that matched descriptions in historical accounts and indigenous narratives. Yet the garden remained elusive, hidden by its own perfect concealment and perhaps by something more, a quality of impenetrability that seemed to. The scientific investigation of the Whispering Pines reveals a botanical mystery so remarkable that it has fundamentally challenged conventional understanding of how ecosystems organize and maintain themselves across time. The garden, when finally systematically studied, displayed characteristics that should have been impossible. A concentration of rare species, far exceeding what ecological theory would predict. Environmental conditions that shouldn't support the observed flora. And most remarkably, a collection of plant species whose properties suggested deliberate cultivation across centuries, possibly millennia. The first systematic botanical survey of the confirmed garden site occurred in 2020, conducted by an international team of researchers led by Dr. Elena Silvestre, a renowned ethnobotanist from the Universidad Nacional. The expedition was made possible by information provided by the 2019 Lost Hiker, whose detailed description of the garden's location finally gave researchers a precise target for their search. What they discovered exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. The garden occupied approximately 47 acres of forest, existing as a distinct microclimate within the larger ecosystem. The boundaries weren't sharp or obvious, rather, the transition from ordinary forest to garden occurred gradually, with increasingly unusual plant concentrations and atmospheric properties becoming noticeable to trained observers about 200 meters from the garden's core. The botanical composition of this transitional zone revealed evidence of deliberate cultivation spanning centuries. Species were distributed in patterns that suggested purposeful arrangement rather than random natural occurrence. At the garden center existed a collection of plant species of extraordinary rarity and botanical significance. Several species were completely unknown to modern science, having escaped documentation in any herbals or botanical references. The species were concentrated in specific microclimates within the garden, suggesting that whoever had cultivated this space possessed sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships and species requirements. One species in particular captured scientific attention, a flowering plant that researchers designated Pinus somnifer rharensis, the sleep-bringing rare pine. This remarkable plant produced flowers with an unusual morphology, petals arranged in spiral patterns that appeared to be optimized for maximum volatile organic compound dispersal. The flowers emitted a complex mixture of chemical compounds including pinene, limonene, and several previously unknown volatile molecules that the research team had never encountered in other plant species. The significance of these chemical compounds cannot be overstated. Pinene is known to have calming properties and is used in aromatherapy practices worldwide. Limonene is associated with mood elevation and stress reduction. But the novel compounds, those never before identified in scientific literature, displayed even more remarkable properties. Initial laboratory studies suggested that these unknown compounds interacted with human neurology in ways that produced profound relaxation without the cognitive impairment associated with sedatives, and the research team documented multiple specimens of Pinus somnifer rarrensis, distributed throughout the garden's core area, growing in conditions that suggested careful maintenance across generations. The trees ranged significantly in age. Some appeared to be over 300 years old, while others were clearly younger. The pattern of ages suggested deliberate replanting cycles, as though someone had been ensuring that the species would persist indefinitely. Even more remarkable was the discovery of pollen evidence in soil samples collected from the garden site. Paleobotanists analyzing the soil cores found that Pinus somnifer rarrensis pollen had been present in the location for at least 600 years, with evidence suggesting possible presence for significantly longer periods. This indicated that the species had either been cultivated in this location for centuries or had naturally evolved there and been subsequently managed. The ecological investigation revealed that the garden existed in a state of extraordinary stability, a climax ecosystem that had reached equilibrium and maintained itself across centuries without significant change. This stability was remarkable because most ecosystems are dynamic, constantly changing in response to environmental fluctuations, species invasions, and natural disturbances. The whispering pines maintained an almost crystalline stability, as though preserved in amber. The explanation for this stability emerged gradually through painstaking investigation. The garden was a deliberately constructed and maintained ecosystem. Every species present had a functional role in the system. Predator-prey relationships, nutrient cycles, water management, and soil chemistry had all been arranged to create a self-maintaining balance. The garden wasn't a wild place that had escaped human influence. It was a masterwork of ecological engineering, a living system designed by people who understood complexity and interdependence with remarkable sophistication. The evidence for deliberate cultivation appeared in multiple forms. The soil chemistry was unusual, showing concentrations of specific minerals and nutrients that suggested amendment across centuries. The root systems of various species were interconnected in ways that seemed deliberate. Mycorrhizal networks had been encouraged through the placement of fungal associates. The water systems showed evidence of ancient irrigation channels, now overgrown but still discernible to trained observers. Most striking was the botanical composition itself. The species present had been selected with clear purpose. Each plant contributed specific properties to the whole system. Nitrogen-fixing species maintained soil fertility. Species with deep root systems brought nutrients from soil depths to the surface. Plants that produced the calming volatile organic compounds were concentrated in areas where humans were likely to walk. Medicinal species were arranged in accessible locations. The garden was simultaneously a place of beauty, a sophisticated ecosystem, a pharmacy, and a therapeutic environment. The research team's analysis led to a revolutionary conclusion. The whispering pines represented an example of traditional ecological knowledge so sophisticated that it approached, and possibly exceeded, the complexity of modern ecological science. The Soa people and their predecessors had understood and applied principles of ecology, botany, chemistry, and systems thinking centuries before these disciplines existed in Western science. Here's something that challenges our assumptions about primitive versus advanced knowledge. From which country are you watching this? Because every culture has examples of traditional practices that embodied complex scientific principles long before those principles were formally documented. What examples can you think of from your region where traditional peoples demonstrated sophisticated understanding of natural systems? Share your insights in the comments. The atmospheric investigation proved equally revelatory. Researchers placed sophisticated air quality monitoring equipment throughout the garden and collected air samples for chemical analysis. The results confirmed what indigenous sources and historical accounts had suggested. The garden produced an unusual atmospheric mixture rich in the volatile organic compounds released by the rare plant species. The concentration of these compounds created what researchers termed in botanical pharmaceutical microclimate, an atmosphere that functioned as a form of medicine. Volunteers who spent time in the garden reported measurable physiological changes: decreased heart rate, reduced cortisol levels, lower blood pressure, and normalized sleep patterns. Brain imaging studies showed increased activity in areas associated with calm and peace, decreased activity in regions associated with anxiety and stress response. Most remarkably, these effects persisted even after volunteers left the garden. The calming influence extended weeks into their return to ordinary environments. The research team hypothesized that exposure to the garden's unique atmospheric mixture essentially reset human stress response systems, allowing them to recalibrate toward more balanced functioning. The mechanism appeared to operate through multiple pathways simultaneously. The volatile organic compounds affected human neurology directly through olfactory pathways. The rarity and beauty of the botanical environment activated psychological mechanisms associated with awe and wonder. The silence and isolation from human-created noise allowed the nervous system to recognize safety and release accumulated tension. The combination created a synergistic effect that exceeded what any single factor could produce alone. This discovery opened remarkable possibilities for medical applications. If the specific compounds produced by Pinus somnifer rarensis could be synthesized or extracted, they might provide novel treatments for anxiety disorders, insomnia, and trauma-related conditions without the side effects associated with conventional pharmaceutical approaches. Yet the research team faced a profound ethical dilemma. Was it appropriate to commercially exploit the garden's properties, or would that represent a betrayal of its sacred purpose and a repetition of the colonial patterns that had already disrupted indigenous stewardship? The garden's botanical significance extended beyond its medicinal properties. Several plant species present in the garden were unknown to modern science and might represent evolutionary developments unique to this microclimate. The garden functioned. The evidence that the whispering pines had been deliberately cultivated across centuries raised perhaps the most profound mystery. Who had created this garden, and through what process had they maintained it across generations despite colonization, cultural disruption, and the loss of written records? The investigation into this question revealed a story of remarkable ingenuity, ecological wisdom, and cultural resilience that challenged everything Western civilization assumed about progress and knowledge preservation. The earliest evidence of intentional cultivation dated back approximately 800 years, based on pollen analysis, soil chemistry, and the documented presence of modified plant species. This placed the garden's origins in the period when Soa civilization was flourishing, before Spanish conquest disrupted indigenous societies. Archaeological evidence suggested that earlier cultivation might have occurred, pushing the garden's history back potentially to 1,000 or even 1,500 years ago. The cultivation had apparently occurred in phases, with distinct periods of active management, followed by intervals of less intensive intervention. The pattern suggested that the garden's maintenance was integrated into the economic and cultural lives of the people who tended it. It was neither an isolated project pursued in constant intensity, nor an abandoned space left to wild growth, but rather a long-term commitment that adapted to changing circumstances, while maintaining the garden's essential character, that Soa knowledge. Keepers who were consulted during the research reported oral traditions about how the garden had been established. According to these accounts, the garden represented a gift from their ancestors, a place created through generations of careful work, passed down through precise instructions about which plants to cultivate, how to maintain them, and what properties they possessed. The knowledge was preserved through oral tradition, with specific individuals designated as guardians who received intensive training in the garden's secrets. The cultivation techniques employed were sophisticated and well adapted to the forest environment. Soa gardeners had apparently used selective breeding to encourage plants with desired characteristics: larger flowers, more intense volatile organic compound production, greater hardiness in the forest microclimate. They had managed water flow to optimize moisture distribution while preventing flooding. They had introduced beneficial fungal and bacterial species to enhance soil chemistry and plant health. Most remarkably, the SOA had apparently understood and applied ecological principles that modern science would only formalize centuries later. The garden's design incorporated concepts of biodiversity maintenance, nutrient cycling, and systems thinking. Species were arranged to create functional relationships. Some plants provided structure and shelter. Others fixed nitrogen or brought up deep soil nutrients. Still others produced the medicinal and calming compounds that gave the garden its unique properties. The challenge of maintaining this sophisticated ecosystem across centuries, through colonization and cultural disruption, speaks to remarkable human resilience and the power of traditional knowledge systems to preserve information without written documentation. Even as SOA society was being destroyed by conquest, even as the Spanish attempted to suppress indigenous practices and knowledge systems, individual SOA people maintained the garden. The mechanism of knowledge preservation through oral tradition proved far more robust than Western education systems had given it credit for being. Specific individuals were trained intensively in every aspect of the garden's maintenance. They learned which plants required what conditions, how to recognize problems in the ecosystem, what interventions were necessary during different seasons. This knowledge was reinforced through repeated practice, through teaching others, and through integration with SOA spiritual and cultural practices that gave the knowledge profound meaning beyond its practical utility. The U.S. research team discovered evidence that the garden had nearly been lost multiple times. During the 18th century, Spanish colonial authorities had attempted to clear sections of the forest for agricultural expansion. The destruction had reached the transitional zone of the garden before colonial efforts were abandoned due to the terrain's difficulty. If the colonial authorities had persisted for just a few years longer, the garden might have been destroyed entirely. During the 19th century, as indigenous populations were further displaced and scattered, the number of people who possessed detailed knowledge of the garden's location and maintenance apparently declined dramatically. There were periods when the garden appears to have been largely abandoned, its careful maintenance discontinued. Yet even without active stewardship, the garden's sophisticated ecology proved stable enough to maintain itself. The ecosystem had been designed so well that it could persist without constant intervention. In the 20th century, the last surviving SOA knowledge keepers transmitted their understanding of the garden to younger generations. Even as traditional practices were being suppressed and indigenous languages were disappearing, the knowledge existed in a precarious state, preserved in the minds of a few elders, difficult to transmit through formal education systems that didn't value indigenous knowledge, threatened with disappearance as the last speakers of traditional languages died. The recovery of this knowledge became one of the remarkable achievements of the research team. Working with indigenous rights organizations and the few surviving SOA communities, researchers conducted extensive interviews with knowledge keepers, documenting their understandings of the garden's properties, maintenance requirements, and cultural significance. This documentation served as both a preservation effort and a formal acknowledgement of indigenous intellectual property rights. The process of knowledge recovery revealed the depth and complexity of SOA understanding. The knowledge keepers could describe not just the garden's current state, but its history, how it had changed over centuries, how different maintenance practices had affected its development, how colonization had disrupted traditional stewardship. They understood the interconnections between different species, the effects of seasonal cycles, the relationships between the garden and broader forest ecosystems. Most profoundly, the knowledge keepers understood the garden's spiritual significance in ways that scientific investigation could illuminate, but never fully capture. To the SOA, the garden wasn't merely a collection of plants or a pharmacy or an ecological marvel. It was a sacred space where human and natural worlds touched, where the boundaries between physical and spiritual reality became permeable, where people could access forms of consciousness and connection that ordinary spaces didn't allow. The spiritual dimension of the garden revealed itself through the experiences of people who spent time there. Visitors reported not just physical calm and emotional peace, but something more, a sense of connection to something larger than themselves, a feeling of being part of the living world rather than separate from it. Some described it as a spiritual experience, others as meditation or deep relaxation, but virtually all reported that something shifted in their relationship to the natural world through their time in the garden. This spiritual dimension wasn't scientifically measurable in conventional terms, yet its effects were real and reproducible. The garden seemed to facilitate a particular state of consciousness, one in which human anxieties receded, individual identity became less rigid, and people felt themselves part of an interconnected whole. Whether this should be understood as spiritual experience, as psychological phenomenon, or as some combination that transcended the Western categories separating spiritual and scientific understanding, remained a matter of interpretation. Here's something that reveals how Western science and indigenous knowledge systems approach understanding reality differently. From which country are you watching this? Because every culture has ways of knowing that integrate spiritual and practical dimensions in ways that Western secular science struggles to accommodate. How does your culture understand the relationship between spiritual practice and practical knowledge? What examples can you think of where spiritual and scientific approaches illuminate different aspects of the same reality? Share your thoughts in the comments. The question of whether the garden should be developed or preserved in its current state became a matter of significant debate among the research team, indigenous communities, and conservation organizations. Commercial interests saw potential for pharmaceutical extraction, wellness tourism, or other economic exploitation. Scientists wanted access for continued research. Some indigenous groups wanted to reclaim stewardship and restore traditional management practices. Conservationists argued for complete protection and isolation from human activity. The resolution that eventually emerged represented a compromise that reflected growing recognition of indigenous intellectual property rights and the need for collaborative rather than extractive relationships with traditional knowledge systems. The Soa communities were recognized as the rightful stewards of the garden. Access was carefully controlled and limited. Research could continue, but only with explicit permission and benefit-sharing agreements. Traditional management practices were being restored, with Soa knowledge keepers training anew this. The most enigmatic aspect of the Whispering Pines remained the extraordinary effect that time spent in the garden produced on human consciousness, a phenomenon that visitors universally described as entering a state of profound, sleep-like peace while remaining fully awake and aware. This paradoxical state, which researchers termed lucid tranquility, seemed to operate through mechanisms that conventional neuroscience could partially explain but not fully account for. The physiological effects were measurable and consistent across different visitors. Brain imaging studies showed that people in the garden experienced synchronized activity across multiple brain regions, an integrated state of neural function that differed from both ordinary waking consciousness and sleep. The prefrontal cortex associated with anxiety and planning showed decreased activity. The default mode network, which operates during rest and introspection, became more active. The amygdala, which processes fear and threat, showed significantly reduced responsiveness. Simultaneously, other brain regions associated with presence, awareness, and sensory processing remained alert. Visitors weren't becoming drowsy or cognitively impaired. They were experiencing a state of heightened awareness combined with deep relaxation. The effect was similar to advanced meditation states achieved by experienced practitioners, yet it occurred naturally and rapidly in visitors with no meditation training. The chemical mechanism appeared to involve multiple pathways. The volatile organic compounds produced by the garden's plant species interacted with olfactory receptors in the nose, sending signals to the brain's limbic system and higher cortical regions. These signals influenced neurotransmitter production, increasing levels of serotonin and GABA, neurotransmitters associated with calm and well-being, while reducing norepinephrine and cortisol, chemicals associated with stress and alertness. But the chemical effects alone didn't fully explain the phenomenon. When researchers isolated and synthesized the plant compounds and exposed subjects to them in laboratory settings, the effects were significant, but notably weaker than the effects of being physically present in the garden. Something about the actual space, the combination of multiple sensory inputs, the psychological impact of the environment, the integration of visual beauty with chemical effects, produced something greater than the sum of its parts. The researchers began investigating the concept of place medicine, the idea that particular geographical locations possessed inherent properties that affected human consciousness and well-being. This concept seemed to bridge spiritual and scientific understanding, acknowledging that specific places could have measurable effects on human neurology and psychology beyond what chemical or visual factors alone could explain. The garden's architecture revealed sophisticated understanding of how landscape design affects consciousness. Water features were positioned to create specific acoustic effects, sounds that had been documented to enhance relaxation and reduce anxiety. The arrangement of plants created sight lines that guided attention toward distant vistas or intricate botanical details, depending on where visitors walked. The elevation and slope of terrain created different microclimates and encouraged specific movement patterns. The air circulation patterns within the garden were remarkable. Wind patterns naturally concentrated the volatile organic compounds in certain areas, while dispersing them in others, creating zones of varying intensity. Visitors moving through the garden naturally encountered increasing concentrations of these compounds as they moved toward the center, allowing for a graduated introduction to the garden's effects rather than an abrupt change. Acoustical analysis revealed that the garden's combination of dense vegetation, water features, and specific topography created a sound environment almost completely isolated from human-created noise. The constant ambient sound level, the whisper of wind through pines, the gentle movement of water, the calls of forest birds, operated at frequencies that were calming rather than stimulating. This silence from human noise allowed the human nervous system to finally relax its constant vigilance against environmental threat. The visual environment possessed particular qualities that research in environmental psychology had identified as conducive to well-being. The colors, greens, earth tones, soft blues from sky glimpsed through foliage, were associated with calm and relaxation. The absence of sharp angles and the prevalence of natural curves reduced the visual stress that human-created rectangular environments induced. The view depths, the ability to see varying distances, from intimate close-range details to distant vistas, provided visual richness that prevented boredom while remaining calming. The research team became increasingly convinced that the garden represented a form of ecological wisdom that Western cultures had largely abandoned. Indigenous peoples had apparently understood that human well-being was intimately connected to environment, and that conscious design of environmental conditions could profoundly facilitate health and peace. This understanding had been dismissed by Western industrial civilization as unscientific superstition, even as modern populations suffered epidemic levels of anxiety, depression, and disconnection from the natural world. One of the most remarkable discoveries involved the garden's effect on time perception. Visitors consistently reported that their subjective experience of time changed in the garden. Hours seemed to pass like minutes, yet they could accurately estimate elapsed time if asked. This temporal distortion was similar to what people experience during meditation or states of optimal engagement. The mechanisms weren't fully understood, but appeared to involve decreased self-referential thinking and increased attentional absorption in sensory experience. The implications were profound. One of the primary sources of human suffering in modern life appeared to be a particular relationship to time. Anxiety about the future, regret about the past, constant mental time travel that prevented presence in the current moment. The garden somehow interrupted this pattern, allowing people to return to a more ordinary, human experience of presence that contemporary civilization had largely trained out of them. Here's something that raises fundamental questions about what constitutes health and wellness. From which country are you watching this? Because cultures around the world have developed different approaches to understanding and facilitating well-being. What practices or spaces in your culture are recognized as promoting peace and health? How do these differ from what Western medical models emphasize? Share your thoughts in the comments about what we've lost and what we might recover about human flourishing. The study of visitors who reported previous trauma revealed something remarkable. The garden appeared to facilitate healing processes in ways that conventional therapy sometimes took years to achieve. Visitors with PTSD reported significant reductions in symptoms. People with chronic anxiety found their nervous systems recalibrating. Even individuals resistant to therapy found themselves naturally opening to processing difficult experiences while in the garden's environment. One research participant described her experience. "I've been carrying trauma for 20 years. Therapy helped, but there was always this wall between me and genuine peace. In the garden, that wall seemed to dissolve naturally, not through forcing or processing, just through being. The environment itself seemed to hold me safely. I could finally let go of the vigilance I've been maintaining my entire adult life. This healing potential suggested mechanisms beyond simple neurochemistry. The garden seemed to activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the system associated with rest, digestion, and social engagement, so completely that people could finally access resources for healing that their constantly threatened nervous systems couldn't access in ordinary environments. The research team developed protocols for therapeutic use of the garden, carefully designed to facilitate healing while preventing overuse or exploitation of the space. The protocols involved pre-garden preparation, specific guidance during the garden visit, and integration work afterward to help people consolidate and maintain the benefits they experienced. Perhaps most intriguingly, the garden's effects persisted long after people left. Studies showed that a single extended visit to the garden produced measurable changes in nervous system function that persisted for weeks or even months. Repeated visits appeared to create even longer-lasting changes, as though the garden was training people's nervous systems into more balanced functioning. The question of mechanism remained partially mysterious. The research team could document the effects with great precision, could explain many of the contributing factors, but acknowledged that something remained beyond their complete understanding, something about the garden that created outcomes exceeding what the identified contributing factors could fully account for. This mysterious element wasn't a deficit in knowledge, but rather a humbling recognition of nature's complexity and the limits of contemporary scientific understanding. As the research team and indigenous communities worked to develop sustainable approaches to the garden's preservation and study, a remarkable phenomenon began to emerge. People who visited the garden often reported experiencing profound dreams during their sleep afterward. These weren't ordinary dreams, but rather vivid, lucid, and emotionally significant experiences that many described as more real than ordinary waking life. The dream research became one of the most scientifically challenging and philosophically perplexing aspects of the garden investigation. When volunteers were studied in sleep laboratories after their garden visits, researchers documented increased REM sleep activity, longer REM periods than baseline, and patterns of brain activity during sleep that indicated particularly vivid dream experiences. The dreams occurred preferentially during the first 3 to 5 nights following the garden visit, with intensity and vividness gradually decreasing over subsequent weeks. What distinguished these dreams from ordinary vivid dreams was their apparent coherence and meaning. While most dreams are characterized by the logical incoherence and rapid scene changes typical of REM sleep, the post-garden dreams maintained narrative continuity and emotional consistency. Visitors reported dreaming of scenarios that felt deeply personal and relevant to their waking lives, yet with a quality of symbolic richness that suggested communication from deeper dimensions of consciousness. One visitor described her post-garden dreams. The dreams weren't random or chaotic like my normal dreams. They were stories about my life, my relationships, my patterns, but told in a way that made me see them differently. It was like my deepest wisdom was speaking to me, showing me truths I already knew but had been avoiding. The dreams continued over several nights, like a series exploring different aspects of the same themes, gradually building toward understanding. The research team began collecting and analyzing thousands of dream reports from post-garden visitors. Despite the individual uniqueness of each person's dreams, reflecting their specific circumstances, relationships, and preoccupations, patterns began to emerge. The dreams frequently involved themes of reunion with lost aspects of self, healing of fractured relationships, confrontation with personal limitations transformed into sources of wisdom, and profound experiences of connection to natural world. Participants across different ages, cultures, and backgrounds reported similar categories of dream experiences. Children dreamed of playing in forests, reconnecting with earlier versions of themselves. Adults dreamed of conversations with deceased loved ones, receiving guidance about life direction, or witnessing transformations of personal challenges into gifts. Elders dreamed of passing wisdom, of their lives acquiring new meaning, of their deaths as transition rather than ending. The consistency of these dream themes across diverse populations suggested that something about the garden was activating deep levels of human consciousness. archetypal, dimensions that transcended individual psychology and cultural conditioning. The dreams seemed to access what psychologist Carl Jung had called the collective unconscious, universal patterns of human experience that emerged, regardless of an individual's specific background or beliefs that sow a knowledge. Keepers offered their own interpretation of this phenomenon. In their understanding, the garden existed partially in ordinary physical reality and partially in spiritual dimensions. The volatile compounds and carefully designed environment facilitated shifts in consciousness that allowed access to realms that were always present, but not normally perceptible to ordinary waking awareness. Dreams were the natural way these dimensions of consciousness communicated with ordinary awareness. From this perspective, the dreams weren't byproducts of altered neurochemistry, but rather messages from deeper wisdom sources, communications, that the garden made possible by creating conditions where human consciousness could expand beyond its normal constraints. The spiritual and scientific perspectives, rather than contradicting each other, illuminated different aspects of the same phenomenon. The research team began documenting specific dream content systematically, creating a database of thousands of post-garden dreams. Machine learning analysis of these dreams revealed recurring motifs and archetypal patterns. The researchers also noted that dream content often proved prophetic. Visitors would report dreams that seemed to predict or guide their future choices, and subsequently describe how their waking lives unfolded in ways their dreams had already explored. This predictive quality of the dreams raised profound questions about the nature of consciousness and time. If people's dreams somehow knew about future events before they occurred, what did that suggest about the structure of reality? Contemporary physics had already suggested that time might not be the linear progression that ordinary experience suggested. The garden's dreams seemed to offer experiential confirmation of these theoretical physics insights. One remarkable case involved a man named Thomas, who had visited the garden as a career crisis point. During his garden visit, he had experienced profound peace, but didn't consciously process any insights about his situation. However, the subsequent dreams proved transformative. Over 5 nights, he dreamed a coherent narrative about a protagonist leaving a secure but unfulfilling career to pursue meaningful work. The dreams included specific scenes exploring the emotional terrain of that transition: fear, uncertainty, but also profound relief and alignment. Thomas subsequently made a major career change that he traced directly to the guidance he received in his post-garden dreams. 3 years later, he described how his waking life had unfolded precisely as his dreams had suggested. The challenges, the unexpected opportunities, the gradual emergence of deeper satisfaction. The dreams showed me the path I needed to walk, he explained. It wasn't that the dreams predicted everything perfectly, but they showed me the emotional and spiritual terrain I would need to navigate. They prepared me for what I couldn't have known consciously, but somehow knew very deeply. The research team began investigating whether the garden's effect on dreams might be as therapeutically significant as its calming effects on waking consciousness. If people could access profound guidance through dreams in the days following a garden visit, the implications for healing and personal development were extraordinary. The garden might function as a natural therapeutic tool far more powerful than conventional approaches. The phenomenon of what researchers termed lucid dreaming, where dreamers were aware they were dreaming while the dreams occurred, appeared significantly more common in post-garden visitors than in the general population. This suggested that the garden somehow facilitated not just vivid dreaming but also the metacognitive awareness that allowed people to engage with their dreams consciously rather than simply being swept along by dream narratives. The neurological basis for this phenomenon wasn't fully understood. The brain regions associated with metacognition and self-awareness showed elevated activity during the dreams of post-garden visitors, compared to the typical pattern during ordinary REM sleep, where these regions are typically suppressed. It was as though the garden had trained the brain into a state where multiple levels of consciousness could operate simultaneously. The imaginative, narrative flow of dreaming combined with the reflective awareness of waking consciousness. Here's something that reveals how different cultures understand dreams differently. From which country are you watching this? Because every tradition has ways of working with dreams as sources of wisdom and guidance. What role do dreams play in your culture's understanding of human development and spiritual life? How do you work with your own dreams? Share your thoughts in the comments about what dreams mean to you and what they might reveal. The implications for understanding human consciousness proved revolutionary. If the garden could facilitate access to deeper wisdom sources through both waking experience and dreaming, what did that suggest about the nature of consciousness itself? The conventional Western model treated consciousness as a singular phenomenon, either awake or asleep, either aware or unconscious. The garden suggested a far more complex picture, where multiple forms of consciousness could coexist, each offering different kinds of knowledge and insight. The research team began exploring whether the garden might facilitate other altered states of consciousness. Some visitors reported experiences that resembled meditation states despite having no formal meditation training. Others described moments of profound connection to the natural world that seemed to transcend ordinary perception. A few reported experiences that they interpreted as spiritual or mystical encounters, moments where boundaries between self and other seemed to dissolve, where they felt merged with something larger than themselves. The psychological interpretation of these experiences emphasized their healing potential. Whether they were understood as spiritual experiences, psychological insights, or neurological phenomena, they produced measurable benefits. People reported greater clarity about their lives, deeper integration of previously conflicted aspects of themselves, improved relationships, better health outcomes, and enhanced sense of meaning and purpose. The spiritual interpretation emphasized that the garden facilitated genuine contact with transcendent dimensions of reality. As the Whispering Pines gained international attention, and increasing numbers of visitors sought access to experience its remarkable properties, a troubling phenomenon began to emerge. The garden itself seemed to be changing. Plants that had thrived for centuries began showing signs of stress. The atmospheric effects that had been so reliable became inconsistent. Visitors reported less dramatic experiences than earlier visitors. Most disturbingly, the garden's ecosystem showed signs of degradation. The research team investigated potential causes with growing urgency. Air quality monitoring showed increased contamination from human sources. Soil analysis revealed compaction from foot traffic. The delicate mycorrhizal networks that had been carefully cultivated over centuries were showing damage. Water quality in the garden's streams was changing. The concentration of volatile organic compounds in the air was decreasing as some plant species struggled to thrive. The Tsoa knowledge keepers who had guided the garden's recovery provided the most profound diagnosis. The garden was literally dying from the attention and intrusion it was receiving. The garden, they explained, had been created not for public consumption but for those who approached it with genuine spiritual intention and respect. The influx of tourists and researchers, even those with good intentions, was violating something essential. About the space, the knowledge keepers spoke of a curse associated with the garden, not a supernatural malevolence but rather a natural consequence built into the garden's nature. The garden existed as a sacred space precisely because it had been protected and hidden. Its power derived partly from its rarity, partly from the devotion of those who tended it, partly from the intention that had been woven into its creation and maintenance across centuries. Once its secrets were revealed to the world, once it became a tourist destination and research site, something essential was lost. One knowledge keeper, Elena Rosado, explained, "My ancestors created this garden for healing and wisdom, not for commercial use or casual visitation. The garden is alive. It has consciousness and intention. When people approach it with genuine reverence and need for healing, it opens itself and shares its gifts. But when people approach it as a commodity, as a resource to extract, as a tourist attraction, the garden closes. It protects itself by becoming ordinary again." The research team faced an agonizing dilemma. The discovery of the garden had created an unprecedented opportunity to study natural systems and potentially develop therapeutic applications that could benefit millions of people. Yet the very act of studying and publicizing the garden was destroying the very properties that made it valuable. The garden's greatest gift, its ability to create profound states of healing consciousness, seemed incompatible with the scale of attention and research that its discovery had generated. The question of whether the garden could survive, whether its remarkable properties could persist despite the unprecedented pressure of human activity and study, became the central concern of all involved. Some researchers argued for immediate cessation of research and tight restriction of access. Others contended that scientific understanding was necessary to preserve the garden's knowledge, even if the physical place couldn't maintain its properties. The indigenous communities faced the most difficult position, attempting to balance their own desire to share ancestral wisdom with their responsibility to protect a sacred space. The degradation appeared to accelerate. Within months of intensive research and increased access, reports from visitors described experiences notably less profound than earlier accounts. The dramatic calming effects remained present but diminished. The lucid dreams decreased in frequency. The sense of connection to something transcendent became less common. It was as though the garden's consciousness was withdrawing, protecting itself through a process of diminishment. The explanation the Tsoa offered was both simple and profound. The garden was choosing to disappear, returning to the wilderness that had protected it for centuries. The garden had always existed in balance between human cultivation and wild nature. As long as it was tended with devotion and respect by people who understood its sacred nature, it thrived. But once it was subjected to the extractive logics of science and tourism, it could no longer sustain itself. Rather than be destroyed by that extraction, it would revert to ordinary forest, hiding its true nature once again. The research team documented this process with a mixture of scientific precision and spiritual grief. Botanical surveys showed plant species declining, while common forest varieties increased. The concentration of volatile organic compounds decreased measurably month by month. Visitors' reports of experiences shifted from descriptions of profound transformation to accounts of pleasant, peaceful time in a nice forest. Remarkable, but no longer transcendent. Some members of the research team interpreted this as confirmation of the garden's consciousness and intention. The garden was protecting itself by refusing to participate in its own commodification. Others offered more conventional explanations. Human disruption was simply damaging the delicate ecological balance that had produced the garden's remarkable properties. Whether understood spiritually or scientifically, the outcome was the same. The garden as it had been was disappearing. Here's something that reveals the tragic consequences of turning sacred things into commodities. From which country are you watching this? Because every culture has examples of sacred places and practices that have been damaged or destroyed through commercialization and disrespect. What examples can you think of from your region where the attempt to preserve or profit from spiritual sites has resulted in their degradation? How do we honor and protect what is sacred while also allowing genuine seeking and healing? Share your thoughts in the comments. The decision made by the Tsoa communities and the research team represented a profound statement about values and responsibility. They chose to close the garden to further research and severely restrict public access. The decision meant abandoning the potential pharmaceutical applications and therapeutic protocols that had been developing. It meant accepting that the extraordinary opportunity to study this unprecedented ecosystem would be foregone. But the decision also offered possibility. The possibility that the garden might recover, that its consciousness and vitality might return, if given the opportunity to retreat from intensive human engagement. The Tsoa took back full stewardship of the garden, restricting access to community members, rare spiritual seekers, and the occasional researcher permitted with explicit consent and ceremonial preparation. The restricted access was structured according to Tsoa protocols developed over centuries. Visitors would fast and meditate before entering. They would spend time in prayer and intention setting. They would move through the garden with specific protocols designed to minimize disturbance. They would spend time in silence, approaching the garden as a sacred space rather than as a resource to be studied. The number of visitors permitted monthly was severely limited, measured in the single digits rather than the hundreds or thousands that had been attempting access during the research phase. Within months, the garden began recovering. New botanical surveys showed plant species returning to health. The concentrations of volatile organic compounds stabilized and then began increasing again. Most remarkably, visitors who entered with proper preparation and respect began reporting experiences similar to those documented in earlier research. Profound states of peace, vivid and meaningful dreams, experiences of connection and healing. The garden hadn't disappeared. It had simply withdrawn from those who approached it with extractive intent, and opened itself again to those who approached with genuine reverence and need. The boundary between commodity and sacred thing had been carefully maintained through restriction and protection. The garden survived by refusing to be commodified. The research findings that had been completed before the restriction were published, but with deliberate limitations on how they were presented. Rather than promoting the garden as a therapeutic resource or a botanical curiosity to be exploited, the publications emphasized the garden's sacred character and the necessity of cultural and spiritual respect for its survival. The papers became less an instruction manual for how to replicate the garden's properties and more a cautionary tale about what is lost when sacred things are subjected to commercial exploitation. The pharmaceutical companies that had been exploring applications of the isolated plant compounds faced a choice similar to that confronting the researchers. They could attempt to synthesize the compounds and develop commercial treatments which would extract value from the garden's knowledge while potentially disconnecting it from its cultural context. Or they could honor the TSOA request for protection and allow the traditional knowledge to remain integrated with the sacred space, rather than being commodified into isolated molecules. As a decade has now passed since the closure of the garden to extensive research and public tourism, what has emerged is not a loss of meaning or value, but rather a transformation in how the garden is understood and its significance recognized. The garden has become what might be called an absence that teaches, a place whose greatest power lies not in being exploited or studied, but in being protected and honored despite the potential value that extraction could provide. The TSOA communities, supported by international indigenous rights organizations and committed researchers, have successfully established the garden as a formal protected site with legal frameworks that recognize indigenous sovereignty and traditional ecological knowledge. The protection extends beyond ordinary conservation status. The garden is recognized as possessing intellectual and spiritual property rights that belong to the TSOA people. Access requires not just environmental permits but cultural and spiritual preparation. The restricted access has paradoxically increased rather than diminished the garden's significance. The select individuals permitted to visit with proper preparation report experiences of extraordinary profundity, experiences that rival or exceed those documented in the early research phase. The garden appears to deepen its gifts when accessed, with genuine reverence and real need for healing, or wisdom-seeking. The most remarkable development has been the integration of the garden into formal, therapeutic and educational protocols developed by the TSOA in collaboration with psychological and medical researchers who have committed to respecting cultural boundaries and indigenous priorities. A small number of carefully selected individuals, those dealing with severe trauma, those at critical life transitions, those genuinely seeking spiritual development, are permitted guided visits to the garden as part of structured healing and learning experiences. The outcomes of these restricted, culturally framed visits exceed by significant measures the results from the earlier unrestricted research phase. Participants report deeper transformations, more sustained benefits, more profound dream experiences, and more complete resolution of the crises that brought them to the garden. The restriction itself appears to be essential to the garden's therapeutic power. The scarcity and difficulty of access creates psychological and spiritual conditions that facilitate profound openness and transformation. The knowledge that is being transmitted through the garden's stewardship represents a form of wisdom that Western civilization had largely abandoned, the understanding that some things cannot and should not be commodified, that sacred places require protection, that the refusal to extract and exploit can represent a form of power and wisdom deeper than commercial success could provide. The research that continues around the garden now operates under completely different assumptions than the initial investigation. Rather than attempting to determine the garden's mechanisms so that its properties could be replicated or commercialized, contemporary research asks questions about how indigenous knowledge systems have maintained understanding of complex ecological and psychological phenomena across centuries without the apparatus of modern science. The research becomes a process of learning from rather than of studying and extracting. The philosophical implications have been profound. The garden's story challenges fundamental assumptions about progress, development, and the relationship between knowledge and control. It suggests that the scientific imperative to understand everything, to optimize and exploit natural resources, represents not necessarily the highest form of wisdom, but rather a particular cultural value that has brought both remarkable achievements and considerable harm. The alternative the garden represents, the choice to leave some mysteries unexplained, to honor boundaries and refusals, to value protection and preservation over extraction and optimization, stands as a challenge to contemporary civilization to imagine different relationships to knowledge, nature, and the sacred. Here's something that reveals fundamentally different approaches to what constitutes progress and success. From which country are you watching this? Because your culture certainly has wisdom about when to preserve things rather than exploit them, about the value of restraint and protection rather than endless growth. What examples can you think of from your tradition or region where the decision to leave something alone, to protect rather than profit, has created long-term value? What can we learn about sustainability from approaches that prioritize respect over extraction? Share your insights in the comments. The garden has become a symbol of indigenous resistance and resilience, a place where ancestral knowledge proved more profound than contemporary science, where the refusal to participate in conventional exploitation created rather than diminished value. The Tsoa people, whose culture had been systematically suppressed during centuries of colonization, had demonstrated that they possessed understanding of human consciousness, ecological systems, and therapeutic healing that exceeded what contemporary Western civilization had achieved, despite its technological sophistication. The impact on indigenous rights globally has been significant. The Whispering Pines case has provided a precedent for recognizing indigenous intellectual property rights, for requiring consent and collaboration rather than extraction, for understanding that some knowledge systems and places require protection rather than open access. Policy changes influenced by the garden's example have begun spreading. Other indigenous communities are asserting control over their ancestral lands and knowledge systems, sometimes closing these to outsiders, to prevent exploitation and ensure cultural continuity. The garden has also inspired a broader movement toward what might be called sacred ecology, approaches to environmental protection and restoration that integrate spiritual and cultural dimensions alongside scientific and practical considerations. Recognition that places can be sacred, that they can possess consciousness and intention, that they deserve respect and protection not merely as resources but as beings in their own right, has begun influencing conservation approaches globally. The scientific understanding that has emerged about the garden, while incomplete by conventional research standards, has proven sufficient for valuable therapeutic applications and for recognition of the sophistication of Muisca botanical and ecological knowledge. The choice not to pursue complete scientific explanation has not prevented the development of beneficial applications. It has simply required that these applications remain integrated with cultural and spiritual contexts, rather than being extracted and commercialized. For the Tsoa people specifically, the garden has represented a remarkable affirmation of their ancestors' wisdom and a powerful tool for cultural recovery and pride. Young Tsoa people who had been taught in colonial education systems that indigenous knowledge was superstition and that progress required abandoning traditional ways have now encountered scientific validation of their ancestral wisdom. The garden has become a symbol of cultural resilience and a bridge connecting younger generations to their heritage. The garden's story continues to unfold in ways that cannot be predicted or controlled. New visitors occasionally appear at the boundary, drawn by intuition or dreams, and are sometimes permitted entry according to protocols that the Tsoa determine. Some report that the garden has guided them toward their life's work, or toward healing of traumas they didn't consciously know they were carrying. Others describe transformations so complete they cannot adequately articulate them in language. The research that continues at the margins of the garden's protection documents these developments with appropriate humility and respect. Scientists who have worked with the garden have undergone their own transformations. Many report that exposure to the garden's presence, even at a distance, has shifted their understanding of what science is for and what human knowledge could become if it operated from different assumptions. Perhaps most profoundly, the garden has preserved something that contemporary civilization was in danger of losing entirely: the recognition that some aspects of human experience cannot be reduced to mechanisms and data points, that some knowledge is inseparable from the contexts that produce it, that some things gain their value precisely through the refusal to exploit them. In a world increasingly organized around extraction and optimization, the garden stands as a quiet testament to the power of preservation, the wisdom of restraint, and the possibility that the deepest human transformations come not through aggressive seeking, but through receptive encounter with mystery that cannot be entirely known or controlled. The garden remains, hidden as always, its mist rising through the pines, its flowers blooming in impossible colors, its consciousness breathing in rhythms that human attention has learned to respect. It continues to heal those who approach it with genuine need and proper reverence. It continues to dream its own dreams, undoubtedly far more complex and profound than any human understanding could capture. And it continues to teach, through its very existence and through its refusal to be commodified, what contemporary civilization most desperately needs to remember. As we emerge from the mist of the whispering pines, returning to ordinary consciousness and ordinary forests, we carry with us insights that extend far beyond this single extraordinary place. We've discovered that the real treasure hidden in the world's remaining wild places isn't resources to extract or mysteries to solve, but rather wisdom about how to live in harmony with the natural world and how to access depths of human consciousness and healing that contemporary civilization has largely forgotten. The story of the garden teaches us that some of the greatest discoveries lead not to exploitation and expansion but to humility and protection. It demonstrates that indigenous peoples possessed and continue to possess understanding of ecological and psychological phenomena that exceeds what Western science achieved. Despite its technological sophistication, it reveals that the choice to honor boundaries and to refrain from extracting value can represent the highest wisdom. Yet the garden's story is not merely about what has been lost or what remains to be protected. It is also about what is possible, about the capacity of the natural world to heal us, about the potential for human consciousness to access states of profound peace and wisdom when given proper conditions, about the possibility of relationships based on respect and reciprocity rather than exploitation and control. The Whispering Pines reminds us that the world still contains mysteries, that not everything has been mapped and categorized, that places of genuine power and transformation still exist for those who know how to seek them with proper reverence. Even more profoundly, it suggests that each of us might cultivate our own inner gardens, spaces of peace and healing that we protect and nurture, that we approach with respect and genuine need, from which we allow wisdom and transformation to emerge. If this exploration of the secret garden of Whispering Pines has moved you, make sure you're subscribed to History Unleashed and hit that notification bell because we're committed to bringing you investigations into the world's greatest remaining mysteries and the wisdom traditions that have been preserved despite centuries of suppression and colonization. What resonates most deeply for you in the garden's story? What does it reveal about what we've lost in contemporary civilization and what might be recovered? How does it inspire you to think differently about sacred places, about knowledge systems beyond Western science, about the relationship between protection and value? Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments, and let us know what other mysteries, legends, and hidden places you'd like us to investigate next. Remember, some of the greatest treasures in this world are not found through aggressive seeking, but through learning to see what has always been present, through approaching mystery with respect and genuine need, through understanding that restraint and protection sometimes represent the highest forms of wisdom and power. The garden waits, breathing its eternal mist, teaching its patient lessons to those who know how to listen. Thank you for journeying with us into the enchanted wilderness. Until we meet again in the mysteries that shape our understanding of the world, stay curious, stay respectful of the sacred places and knowledge systems that remain. And remember, the greatest adventures often lead us not outward into the world, but inward into the depths of consciousness and connection that have always been available to those who know how to find them. Welcome home from the forest. The mist still clings to the pines,